My name's Bonnie Reese. I'm Global Director of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. And on behalf of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute, on behalf of Nancy Stout, Nancy, our Academic Director, Vice Dean of the Law School, and on behalf of the Schwarzenegger Institute team, Conyers Davis and Mebus Burley, it is our pleasure to invite you here to this conversation tonight. A conversation we know is going to be very fascinating about Chris Matthews' new book, Tip and the Gipper, When Politics Worked. But before we get to the conversation, I wanted to just do, on behalf of the Institute, just do a few acknowledgments. I want to acknowledge, of course, our friends from the USC Price School. Dean Jack Nod, who's not able to be here tonight because he's off internationally recruiting great international students, I'm sure. John Sonego and the remarkable staff and faculty and scholars from Price, not just for being here tonight, from the remarkable support and friendship that you've given the Institute. We're very grateful. I also want to acknowledge the many people here that actually served in the Schwarzenegger administration. I want to thank you for being here tonight and for your continued commitment to public service and for your friendship. But of course, as always, we really want to thank the USC students for being here tonight. USC is one of the most respected universities in the world. And the reason it's one of the most respected universities in the world is because of its remarkable student body and because of the world-class education that USC offers its students. And for that reason, the Schwarzenegger Institute is so proud to be here at USC, and we're so proud of our role and how we can contribute to that world-class education by bringing great leaders and great thinkers and great speakers here for conversations for our students to participate in. So before we get to this conversation, just wanted to say why we are so excited about the topic of government and leadership and getting government working for the people and putting people over politics. That's a very core part of the Schwarzenegger Institute mission. Because while our mission includes bringing the great world leaders together to seek and support solutions to the challenges we all face in environment and energy and education and health and wellness and economic recovery and job creation, we know that our leaders in our government will not be able to address any of those challenges until they learn to work together. So that topic is at the heart of what the Institute is going to be involved in. And when Arnold was governor, Arnold would always say, I had the privilege of serving as his senior advisor and later as Secretary of Education. Arnold always said that to everybody, that the people elected me not to be a servant of the party, but to be a servant of the people. And Arnold led that way every day for both terms of office. Many leaders, governors or presidents, will bring into their administration, either at a senior level or in cabinet, one token person from the other political party. But Arnold's administration was truly bipartisan. All that mattered to him is that someone was smart, someone was competent, and someone shared his commitment to put people over politics. Arnold had everyone at the table. Whatever challenge he was facing, Arnold would have Democrats, Republicans, constituencies, regardless of their political point of view. He welcomed them at the table. And Arnold also fought for political reform. Against the wishes of both Democrats and Republicans who were happy with the status quo, Arnold went to the people of California who overwhelmingly supported political reforms. And recently, when all of us with continued frustration watched the federal government shut down and editorials around the country were writing about it, almost all of them mentioned, let's look at what happened in California when Schwarzenegger was governor and these political reforms were passed, and how that's yielding a government that is more accountable and responsive to the people. So we will continue this at the Schwarzenegger Institute and at USC to make this a mission to look at. And all of you will be getting invited to a major symposium we'll be having in February, Government and Leadership, Putting People Over Politics, as we continue on this important topic. And we're so grateful, Chris, that you're here with your book because, you know, as they say, you've lifted the curtain and shown a very important part of history and two remarkable political figures, a liberal Democrat Speaker of the House from Massachusetts, a conservative Republican president, and how they were able to work together. And while we've all heard the quote, those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it, in this case, Chris, I think we may want to study history so we can repeat it. So we're also grateful to have the highly respected, beloved Kevin Starr, California historian, USC professor, and great friend to Arnold and to the Institute here to facilitate this conversation. And Kevin, before I turn it over to you, I know that our chair, Governor Schwarzenegger, wanted to make a few comments before we begin the conversation. So everyone, we hope you enjoy this, and I turn it over to you, Arnold.
Thank you, and there's not much more to say after you've said it all. But I just want to say thank you to you for your great leadership. The USC Schwarzenegger Institute, you're doing an outstanding job, and just to organize this, I know is very hard work. And I always had faith in you and believed in you, so you have been a jewel. So thank you very much. Let's give a big hand again to Bonnie. I've known Chris for a long time. The work he's done after college, being in the Peace Corps, and then becoming a speechwriter for President Carter, and then later on working for Tip O'Neill as a close advisor and as a top advisor and strategist, and then doing his TV show, obviously, Hardball, and he has interviewed me several times, especially during very critical times when I ran for governor. He did some great interviews that helped me in my polls and to win.
We're rooting for you.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that. And so it's great to have you here, and thank you for this great book, because this is really a gift to everybody, because as Bonnie has said, it is extremely timely for this book to come out. I mean, because now it's the height of partisanship in Washington. It's the height of where the city is literally frozen and nothing gets done. I mean, nothing in the last few years that we can really be proud of. And so to have someone come out with a book and to write about the times when things really did happen, and there was a lot of action created where Republicans and Democrats worked together. They had their own ideology, they had their own beliefs, their own philosophy, no two ways about that. Tip O'Neill was not like Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was not like Tip O'Neill, but after 6 o'clock, as you have shown, as Chris has shown in the book, after 6 o'clock they got together and they did the Irish jokes and the drinks, and they started working together. And it's wonderful of how well they worked together and how they gave each other victories. It was not all about me, but they were sharing victories. Sometimes Ronald Reagan had victories, and then Tip O'Neill had victories. And that's how they protected each other, and it was wonderful to read that. So I think everyone should get this book, read it very carefully, and it's great to have you here for a panel discussion. And Kevin, thank you very much for being here. You, of course, have been a jewel and a professor.
Well, Governor, I see
Kevin
my role.
Starr.
I see my role rapidly disappearing
No,
before
not at
my
all.
very eyes.
No.
But,
Kevin, I just want to say, is one of the smartest people that ever met, one of the great historians, and I've had the pleasure of working with him during my administration. So thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you, Governor. It was a pleasure to work for you. The style you brought, and a kind of quality of ironic and humorous friendliness that you brought to staff meetings and carrying on the business of government. It's a pleasure to see you again. And you mentioned, Governor, and I'll just formulate this to Chris Matthews right away, this question of friendship. Incidentally, before I go on, this is a superb book. It's beautifully researched, beautifully written. It's not just a book that just appeared after a 6 weeks disappearance. There's a tremendous amount of work in this book and research, and you're to be congratulated. And in his autobiographical statements earlier in the book, Chris says that his experiences in politics led him away from an academic career. But I think that a book like this and some of your other books, your study of President Kennedy, they become really part of the enduring record of history itself. So don't worry about an academic career. Academics will study you. Now let me bring up something which the governor brought up, friendship. And the governor had these two lovable Irishmen there having a couple drinks, etc. But, while I agree that there was an element of that, certainly there's a photograph in the book that suggests that, there was a much more complicated, complex relationship that you sketch out. It wasn't just good old boys to each other or pals to each other. Yeah. There was something else that you suggest.
Well, no relationship is symmetric. And there's the courted and the courting. And Reagan was really liked Tip. And I know this from Ron Reagan, who's a friend of mine, and Nancy, I can tell from her, is a friend of mine. And Reagan was a lonely guy, a loner. His friends were his wife's friends' husbands, which often happens. Your social life gets steered away from you. But Tip was a tough, tough customer. And what stopped him from being a buddy of Reagan's, although they did get along on the history, he did love the fact he'd been in the movie and then played the Gipper, and he loved all the Irish. They did accept him as a fellow Irishman. On the drinking front, Reagan had the problem in the family. Tip had the family problem. Most of us have the family problem in our crowd of what Reagan called the Irish curse. And it's not refusing to always be focused on getting even. That's one of the curses. The other curse is booze, obviously. And Reagan's father was a drunk. He had to carry him in the house off the porch, and it was this embarrassment to him. Tip's brother was a drunk. One of his kids had a tremendous alcohol and drug problem. It was very much part of their world. Tip used to have no sympathy for if you couldn't drink the way he wanted you to drink. I mean, I'd go to lunch with him and stuff. He said, "Don't you drink at lunch?" And I'd say, "I don't." He says, "Can't you handle this stuff?" And I say, "Actually, no." And he just felt it was a discipline issue, and you just drank to a certain amount, and then you stopped. That's all. And he was one of those great old Irish guys that drank right to the end. Reagan didn't drink hardly at all, but he did formally, in formal occasions. But the friendship, the key thing is, it's not some freaking bromance story here. This is about two guys who are professionals in their 70s. They knew that this had to get done. No more screwing around. When you're in your 70s, you know that life, you're in their last act of public life. And this is when you're going to get it done. You don't need more speeches. You don't want to come up with a great speech when you're 75 years old. You want to get something done, something that hits the record book. So they knew they had to fix Social Security. They did it. They knew they had to fix up the tax system. They got the rate down to 28%. But they equalized, earned income with equity income, something the progressives wanted. They really did. Tip really did help Reagan in the Cold War. And I got all that in there. But they knew it was time for action and for deals. And to me, you go to a car dealer not to haggle, but you may haggle to get the deal. But you remember why you're there, to get the car. That's why you went down there. And so they always remembered they went to make the deal. They didn't just go to make the argument, and they were grown-ups. And our chief counsel, Kirk O'Donnell, used to say it this well. He'd say, always be able to talk. And they could. And they could deal. And they did it. And Reagan told me personally about the After 6 thing. He said, when he came up to give a State of the Union, I said, "Welcome to the room where we plot against you." And Reagan said, "Oh, no, not after 6. The speaker says we're all friends after 6. And that's why I first heard it, never heard it again until I read Tip's memoirs. They never talked about it publicly. They just had this little secret deal where they would connive.
Well, crossing partisan lines, Governor, you did that, not necessarily, although I'm thinking of your chief of staff, Susan Kennedy, a Democrat. You, right from the beginning, had made appointments, Republicans and Democrats. And was that characteristic of your coming of age politically before becoming governor, that you moved in both those circles?
Well, first of all, as you know, I was married to a Democrat and slept with a Democrat. So, I mean, you get to know them very well. But on the other hand...
I think a new philosophical principle has just been announced here.
That's right. But on the other hand, I always felt like if we just pick for an administration Republicans, then we cut out half of the talent of a state. And so I didn't want to do that. So I wanted to interview people to come into my administration based on who was the best and who believed in what the direction I wanted to go, rather than saying, "Are you a Republican?" and start the meeting like that. I never asked anybody that I interviewed if they were a Republican or a Democrat or declined to state. That didn't matter. So this is why I ended up with a lot of Democrats in my administration. Now, of course, that backfires also because, I mean, there was a time in 2006 when I picked Susan Kennedy as my chief of staff. And the Republican Party of California, they called me for a meeting across the street from the Capitol at the hotel, because you're not allowed to do politics in the Capitol, only policy. So we met across the street at the hotel, and the whole room was full with the Republican leaders there, the party leaders. And they said, "You appointed Susan Kennedy as the chief of staff?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, we want you to get rid of her." So I looked around and I said, "Well, wait a minute, did someone just this last few minutes, without me knowing, rewrite the laws and the rules?" They said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, as far as I know, I said, the governor makes the appointments to his team, not the party." And they said, "Well, we cannot work with you, we cannot trust," and all this. Well, anyway, after an hour meeting, we solved that problem. And we made it very clear that she would stay, that I have absolute confidence that she's going to represent me well, and she's going to be there with all the meetings, and she's going to be a great chief of staff. And she ended up exactly that. She was a great chief of staff the months before we met, and she was a great chief of staff the 4 years after that. And I was delighted to have her, and she was a hardworking person, and she was not at all partisan. She represented me where I wanted to go. So it is a struggle when you do that, when you have Democrats and Republicans in one way, but in the other way, I felt I was enlightened. I had always interesting debates between Democrats and Republicans, and I think that it helped the state because I was not voted in to be the governor of the Republicans. I was the governor of all of the people, of all 38 million people. And to me also the same thing was with issues. It was never a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. We went to do environmental issues, as you know, the most historic environmental accomplishments here in California, and then healthcare issues, education issues, and all of those things. It didn't matter if someone said this is a Democratic issue or this is a Republican issue. We just did those because it was good for the people.
I noticed, Chris, in your book, first of all, the fascinating account of your earlier career with President, speechwriter for President Carter, and then wanting to work with the Senate and working as a Capitol policeman for a period of time, and working almost 2 jobs as a Senator Moss's aide, and then also as a Capitol.
You have to be a cop at some time.
You have to be a cop at something.
You have to play that part.
You either could have done that.
Gun too, 38.
You could have done that or gone into the seminary, but you already were married, so you couldn't have done that. What about the question of the way in your book that your own admiration for Ronald Reagan surfaces over time? In other words,
because it's so strange, and Bill Clinton, President Clinton's the same way. In our generation, we grew up with Reagan as a very popular guy in our lives. I mean, he only later in the 50s that I started to read, and I was sort of a young conservative. I'd been reading about his involvement with the conservative movement, but it was very mild-mannered. It was just anti-communist, and we're all anti-communist, so that wasn't a big deal. But he had gotten more involved in anti-communism in the 50s. But when he was host of GE Theater every Sunday night at 9, he was a very likable guy. I always liked him. He would just introduce the show. It was a great gig, really. He introduced a weekly drama. It was always different. It was I forget the term for it. They don't have it in television anymore. It was a totally different cast every week, a totally different story every week, and an anthology series. But we really liked him. And then he ran for governor, and he gave the big speech for Goldwater, and I found myself working against him. I wouldn't have worked against him, except I worked for Tip. But I also thought that he was getting an unfair advantage over Tip, that winning the arguments too easily when I went to work for him. And I thought there needed to be some balancing out, so I worked like hell for O'Neill. I mean, I was a total frightening partisan. And I was as more partisan than the speaker was. And I always said, let's go, let's fight, let's go to war. And yet he always wanted a deal at the end, which I didn't get in the way of, obviously, but he always wanted to make something work. And he would always go, look, if you give me 50 votes on that tax bill, I'll get you the rest. If you give me 100 on this, I'll give you the rest. He would say to Reagan, you want to pass the debt ceiling increase? Okay, just give me a letter to every Democrat asking for that. That's all he asked for, just so our guys don't get screwed. So all I want is a letter from you tomorrow saying vote for the debt ceiling to each member of my caucus, and then they'll do it. But I'm not going to lay our guys out there to be tackled by your guys. And it worked. This kind of deal making worked. Give me 50, give me 100. They haggled and they got stuff done. It's so inspiring. It's thrilling that politicians can be politicians. That's what you're supposed to do. And by the way, if you get a guy to agree with you, you lay the blame on him. That's the brilliance. I don't understand why they don't deal. If I were the president right now, I'd get, okay, we got to restrict entitlements. Okay, I'll make a deal with Boehner, and I'll blame him for the fact we had to restrict entitlements. But he'll give me something on revenues, and he can blame me for having to raise revenues through corporate tax reform. I mean, blame the other party because the deal had to be done. You just got to accept the fact that the deal has to be done. We got to deal with the deficit. You got the sequestration coming up in January, another $100 billion, cutting the military by way too much. Just say, look, we have to do this to save our national security, and therefore we're going to do this, and I'll blame the other guy for his piece of the action. But they don't think like that. They're chicken. They just go, oh, it's better to do no. Just it's always better to say no. The safest thing for Boehner to do is go back to his caucus and say, I didn't give nothing away. I didn't do nothing. I'm not even here. I don't exist. I'm just a scared guy who cries all the time. And if you don't, they don't. And Neil defended President Reagan on Lebanon against his majority of his caucus. You got to be nervy enough to take on your own, like the governor does. You got to take on your own party. As Jack Kennedy once said, sometimes party loyalty asks too much.
Governor, just taking this scenario that Mr. Matthews just given us, can you think back during your time, did you have good supporters from the other side of the aisle, or did you have those who opposed you just chronically from the other side of the aisle, or was there a mixture of the two?
Well, I was, as you know, in a very unique situation because I think there was probably never in a history in California where there was a governor sitting that belonged to one party and then everyone else around you is from the opposite party.
That was only one of the ways in which you're unique, Governor.
No, but I mean, think about that because people forget that they did the recall to recall the governor, but I mean, in fact, they should have recalled everybody because California did not get into that state just because of a governor. It was because it was a dysfunctional system, and so the whole system was failing. So here I was in Sacramento as a Republican, and the controller was a Democrat, the treasurer was a Democrat, the lieutenant governor was a Democrat, the head of education was a Democrat. Everyone was a Democrat. Everyone around me. So when you try to get anything done, there was always the first question for them, should we have him let him have this victory or not? So that was
everyone was a Democrat. It sounds like an audience testing for MSNBC, doesn't it?
It is, but I mean, let me. So what I did was I realized right away. So we would have problems with the budget. They would not be able to make the cuts because it was surrounded by Democrats. The Democrats had the majority, but there were a lot of issues that they were interested in dealing with, which was environmental issues. I'm a big believer in protecting the environment, reducing the greenhouse gases, creating the million solar roof, the low carbon fuel standard, all of those things, building more solar plants in California is the best place for that. So I did all of this very successfully with the Democrats. The same thing with healthcare reform. We did that with the Democrats. I mean, there was a workers' compensation reform, endless amount of things, and including building infrastructure. Remember, we built like $60 billion of infrastructure here during my time. It was all done with Democrats and Republicans together. So, instead of finding the things that you should fight on, you find the things that you could agree on, and that's how we get a lot of things done. But like I said, then when it came to budget issues, there I had a major struggle, and I never could really solve the budget problem of California because I just didn't have everyone there supporting my philosophy.
I'm going to come back later, Governor, to the political reforms because I think we should do more of that. I'd like to ask Chris Matthews, a very powerful part of your book, a chapter, among the many chapters that I was taken with, was the whole thing about Lebanon. Yeah. And the 200-plus Marines who were killed there and the deep divisions on that. Because I looked, although you didn't explicitly say that, it sort of foreshadowed Iraq and Afghanistan in the sense of what the limitations were of foreign intervention. And it really was a very serious point of contention between the two, wasn't it? That they,
well, actually, look, we were so naive. We put Marines into Lebanon the first time to help Yasser Arafat get out alive. We basically were in there to help him get out. The deal was to get him out of Lebanon and send him to Tripoli. And that worked. And then lo and behold, they put the Marines back in again. Reagan wanted to bring them back in again to try to be a diplomatic linchpin, a military linchpin to a diplomatic effort to try to bring the parties together in Lebanon. Big mistake. We became a target. Everybody knew we were pro-Israeli. We could have kidded ourselves, which we did, and thinking we were there as neutrals. Everybody knew we weren't neutral. And we ended up guarding the airport at Beirut and becoming targets. And what I've been able to figure out is there's a whole town around them which was all Islamist. It was called Khomeini-ville. Then everybody knew what their attitude was. But the scary thing was how stupid we were. When we were hit, and the Marines were hit, and the crazy bomber drove through the front, got through all the tiger teeth, and managed to get there and blow these guys up in their sleep. Tip or somebody, I think it was Tip, said, we never expected terrorists. And they thought the army would come in uniform with the bugle blowing, and that would be the enemy. It had all changed over there. And but you know, Tip thought of Lebanon as part of Europe and part of America. He said it's part of our world. He knew a lot of Lebanese people. and there are a lot of Lebanese people in America. And he thought, well, that's part of our world. We got to defend it. And he had an old world sort of constituency attitude. You look out for people you know. And he got involved in backing Reagan, and he was miserable, but he stuck with him. But he did not stick with him on Nicaragua. They went to the war on that one. And Tip thought it was United Fruit down there. He thought it was imperialism. He heard everything he got from the nuns. All the Maryknoll nuns told him about what was going on down there, and he didn't believe a word that Poindexter and Albert North and that crowd did. And they ended up getting in trouble with Iran-Contra because Tip wouldn't give them any money. But it was the whole, look, we were out to lunch in the Middle East. We don't know what we're doing over there. Reagan never understood it. Tip didn't understand it. I don't know which of our presidents has really gotten a sense of how to find a future for American influence and policy in the Middle East. I mean, what do you do? And looking at Iran right now, I think I'm all for any deal that prevents us from going to war. Because I think the war will go on, and they'll rebuild, definitely go to a nuclear weapon if we knock them out once, or Israel does. They'll definitely go back and do it again, because their nationalism will not permit them to not build a nuclear weapon once they're attacked for having one. They have to have one then. So you're guaranteeing a nuclear-armed Iran, ironically, if you attack them, because they will be built. Now, the diplomacy may not work, but I think it's still an unknown to all of us. We don't know what Rouhani's up to. We don't know whether he's for real or he's a charm expert. We don't know. But anyway, I'm just going to say I can't defend Reagan in the Middle East. I don't think he was dynamite on two things: get the government off your back by cutting taxes and cutting government. He hated big government, and he hated communists. He hated communists, but yet he never wanted to go to war with them. He knew we could never have a nuclear war. In fact, he hated mutual assured destruction. And he was so glad to get rid of it when he was able to begin to do that starting in '85.
Well, that's the note of triumph. Although you're very careful to spread the credit to so many people. Your writing on Gorbachev is excellent. The book ends up triumphantly with the end of the Cold War, and that was a really remarkable.
Reagan was so smarter than. And his human instinct that this guy was not Molotov, that this guy was a new breed. He wasn't knocking people off in the middle of the night. He wasn't Khrushchev even. And Khrushchev, by the way, is a mixed bag. I don't think he was the worst person that ever lived. I think he got us through the Cuban Missile Crisis by cutting the deal on the Turkish missiles. But I think that the meeting that Tip had with Gorbachev is one of the great moments. You know how politics has changed? Here's Bryant Gumbel, the morning of April 10th, 1985, which I discovered after I wrote the book. At this hour, this is a cold open on the show that morning. At this hour, a bipartisan delegation is meeting in Moscow with the new Soviet leader. They're carrying with them a letter from the president asking for a meeting. The delegation is led by Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, Jr. Now, you can't imagine that headline today. You can't imagine Obama sending Boehner over to meet Putin. And yet then it was treated as a normal, unexceptional reality. And there was Tip over there swearing to the guy. He said, first of all, Gorby wanted to know what an opposition was. He couldn't figure out what it was. And he said, Tip says, I'm the opposition. He said, well, what's that? And he said, well, it means we don't disagree on everything, which I love that line. And then he said, but Reagan's our only president. We're with him on this. And by the way, even though we've disagreed, he said, when it comes to nuclear weapons reduction, this guy really believes in it. So he was helping him to set him up. And then every time Reagan met with Gorby, whether it was Geneva or it was Reykjavik, every time Tip would secretly in the back room make sure that the real lefties wouldn't do anything to screw it up. He made sure no more debating about defense spending during the time Reagan was meeting with Geneva over arms. He said, I want Reagan to be able to pick up the check. That was his line. And then later at Reykjavik, he called off Ron Dellums and Eddie Markey, my friend, were ready to have a big freeze vote on the floor, which would have completely cut the legs out from under Reagan as he met in Gorbachev. And these guys are crying because they know they have the votes, but they're not going to do it because they don't want to undermine Reagan. And so this stuff goes on, this patriotic stuff behind the scenes. I'm not filling you with schmaltz here. People are really patriotic when it comes to the tough points, and they really did do their bit. But Reagan deserves credit for ending the Cold War, not anybody else. I mean, it was him.
Well, in terms of credit, in terms of the history of California, I think something that Arnold, Governor. I think of him as Arnold, but since I work for him, I call him Governor.
You can call me Arnold. Or Schnitzel.
I told the governor when I worked for him that the official title for the governor is Your Excellency. He really liked that. He really.
It's a old world.
Arnold,
I call him governor, by the way.
Governor, you passed over very quickly what I think is, in terms of the long-term effects of your administration, was political reform. I think the greenhouse is very important. That's futurist also, and the infrastructure is important. I think the way you handled a number of crises, especially in the fires in Southern California, was very exemplary. But that political reform, the idea that trying to open up the politics of California so that centrist, bipartisan, centrist Democrats, centrist Republicans, et cetera, can start filling up the corridors of power, both in Washington and in Sacramento, I think is a very important long-term reform of yours. Really should take great pride in that.
Well, thank you. And I think that what Chris said just now about, and it is really well written in the book about Ronald Reagan sending Tip O'Neill over to Moscow, it just shows to you that he chose of what's best for the country and for the world rather than what is best for the Republican Party. I guarantee you that the Republican Party was not happy when he sent Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, the leading Democrat, over to Moscow with a letter from him. But it was very important because by the time Gorbachev was through with that meeting, he realized that, yeah, there is opposition parties, but in this case, fighting the Soviet Union and fighting the Cold War, they're together. Democrats and Republicans are together as one team. And therefore, there was no kind of getting around it, so they had to deal with that. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what we need in Washington today, to look beyond the party line and the ideology and all of this and be locked into that ideological corner and think about what is good for the country, because what is going on right now is not good for the country. And I saw that happening in California. I saw that the way the gerrymandering works, that was started 200 years ago, it's a fixed system. It locks in the incumbents, keeps them safe. It's an incumbent protection racket. And they don't have to make any efforts. I mean, in the last 250-some elections, congressional elections, there was none that changed party hands in California, to just see how fixed the system is. So I said to myself, if we really want to have change, we got to go and have political reform. Now, this was a huge undertaking, because both of the parties hated it. Immediately was called by both leaders of the parties and said, Arnold, relax. I mean, this is not a good idea. Both of us don't like it, so let's stay away from it. I said, no, we're going to go to the ballot. We're going to go to the people. I know that you don't like it, but we're going to have change. And we lost 5 times. 5 times. As a matter of fact, the press asked me, says, Governor, when are you going to get the message that the people say no? I said, well, when you do weightlifting, and you come from that background, you try to lift the 500 pounds as many times until you do it. I said, so this is the world I come from. I said, I never give up. And then the 6th time we won. And then we went to open primaries, and we did the same thing with open primaries. So those two together, having the districts drawn by ordinary folks that are smart in this subject and not by the legislators, to take it away from the lawmakers and to give it to ordinary people, they now drew districts that make sense. And it changed things dramatically in California. And the open primaries on top of it, where Democrats and Republicans vote in the same primary. So now you have to appeal to labor and also to business, not just to labor or not just to business. So it also changed, and all of a sudden now there were a lot of changes in the last congressional election. 12 already changed. So I mean, there's tremendous changes, and also in the outcome. Now you see Republicans all of a sudden voting for immigration reform in California, which they never did, were always against it, and crucified me because I endorsed immigration reform. And you see Democrats all of a sudden trying to undo some of the environmental regulations that kill business sometimes. So you see things happening here, the way they're voting, that finally is a refreshing way to see that it puts a big smile on my face to see now slowly the results coming out of that, because we got to bring people more to the center and serve the people rather than the party.
I agree. You know, I think the problem in most of the country has been that you can't lose a primary except to somebody younger than you and to your more extreme right or left. You never lose to a moderate. because that's the game. You're in a bidding war on your left to be the most left-wing congressman from New York, Washington, Philadelphia, where I'm from, Seattle, the Berkeley area, San Francisco, L.A. Just be the most liberal. And if anybody tries to be a moderate, they say, oh, he's sold out to downtown. He's no good. We got to get somebody younger and more left-wing in there. And the same way in Utah or in Wyoming, Liz Cheney says that this guy, Enzi, isn't right-wing enough. I mean, what do you want? He said Bob Bennett's not right-wing enough. Mitch McConnell is running against somebody to his right. Thad Cochran's going to say. And the same thing in the big cities of the North. You can't lose a primary to somebody to your right in a big city. So the way it works is it's just guaranteed to create lefties and righties. And only about 50 seats in the country are really open to a real debate. Maybe Bucks County, Pennsylvania has a decent race once in a while, or Montgomery County somewhere. Most, except for the suburbs, it's all locked in. It's just locked in.
And this is why we need reform, political reform, Kevin. We need all over the United States. We need to get rid of the gerrymandering. There's a lot of states that have an initiative process, and there's already a lot of action going on, if it's in Utah, Washington State, Arizona, Florida, all over in Ohio and so on. So I think that you will see a movement because people can only take this in action for so long. So I think there's going to be great things happening in the future in that regard.
Well, I think, Governor, those reforms really won't be the first time that California really had a national effect. I mean, in terms of politics over time. Now we have time, please, for questions.
Why do you think that our country is so divided right now, or do you think it's only Congress that's so bipartisan? Well,
it's been a long transition to where we're at now. It's not one. I can name names, but I'll sound partisan. But I'm a student, as you pointed out, Kevin, of all this stuff. Ever since I was born, I've been fascinated with politics because I care about my country, and mainly about the anti-communist cause. That's always been the most important issue. I grew up hiding under my school desk at Catholic school. I mean, that's what we did. We had air raid drills because the incoming was coming, and we had 15 minutes to get ready for it, and a flash of light and a general judgment. It was all coming quick. So I always thought it was important. But here's a great story. In 1947, I told on the show tonight, in 1947, two Congress people from the freshman class of the House of Representatives were picked to go up to Pennsylvania to argue about Taft-Hartley, a labor issue. And the two guys were Jack Kennedy and Dick Nixon. It was their first debate. It wasn't in 1960. It was in 47. And these young guys, both Navy officers from World War II, South Pacific, both pretty young guys. One was rich, obviously, one was poor. One was a Republican, one was a Democrat, one was Catholic, one was Quaker. And they went up there to debate, and they had a hot debate. It was a labor crowd, a business crowd. Like you said, it was a mixed crowd. They were rooting for both guys. Nixon was playing the Republican side. Kennedy was playing it both ways. He was charming the audience and ignoring Nixon. And that night, they went off for burgers over at the Starr diner, and everybody said how they were buddies. And talking sports and the usual stuff. They get back on the train. They stay in the same compartment back to Washington, midnight train, the Capital Limited back to Washington. They flip for the bottom bunk. Nixon gets the bottom bunk, Kennedy gets the top bunk, and then they spend the whole night talking about something that's coming in the world that didn't have a name yet. It was called the Cold War. It was going to affect both their lives. I would love that movie. These two guys, friendly enough to share the compartment. Obviously, it didn't have the same ending as North by Northwest, but they didn't go in the tunnel, but metaphorically. But I think that's changed, and then all the way through, politics has just gotten degenerated since then. It's just more and more. Tip always said, when we went overseas to Europe or somewhere, everybody always said it was great because most delegations from other countries, they sat in different sides of the room even. He says, we all hang together, and that was different. He and Bob Michael, Jerry Ford were all friends, and they played golf, and they were buddies. And his best friends were, Democrat, Republicans, Sil Conti, and the wives are big friends. One thing Newt Gingrich did, not that I will make him, I'm not going to say any further about him except what he did. He told all his freshmen every year when he was speaker, keep your wives back in the district. Now, what that does is create no social life in Washington. You call home to the wife, the kids are causing trouble, they're into booze, they're into trouble at school, and you have terrible relationships with your wife. Just terrible, because every time you call up, there's trouble at home and you're not there. How come you're not here? You're out there having fun in D.C., and I'm home with the kids, rah, 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 rah. So that's going on. Meanwhile, it's just trouble. And Tip said every time, because he didn't bring his family to Washington, he said, the minute you can afford it, bring your family to Washington. because you create a social life in Washington. You have friends in D.C. Over the weekends, you actually hang out together with the guy you've been arguing with. And that's really changed. And now they don't. They go home every weekend with the jet planes, the ones, and it's just not a friendly town anymore. There's no buddies anymore. And I think you need the buddies to be able to deal. And you need the wives, too, to help you. When you're really mad at the other guy, the wife says, come on, we're friends. Come on, you know they're friends of yours. And then you work things out. But some people don't like that old style politics. I like it. And they play cards every night, too. That whole card playing thing was a big part of Washington. And Tip used to say you either chase women, drink, or you play cards. Well, the first two go together, but the cards were separate. The cards kept him out all night. So he was pretty organized about that, and he got to be Speaker of the House by playing cards. And this new president of ours, he's not a new president anymore, doesn't do any of that. That's a big problem. He doesn't have friends. He doesn't have these guys over to the White House. The greatest asset the guy has, and Bill Clinton knew this, is allow people to come over and hang out at the White House. He meets them at the Jefferson Hotel for an hour and a quarter. It's very organized, and they know that he doesn't like them. He knows he's meeting them at a hotel because he wants to get rid of them, so he can leave when he wants to. He just doesn't like being a politician.
You chronicle one event where President Obama is at something for about 20 minutes or 25 minutes, a fundraiser, he comes by.
Well, I didn't do it, but somebody else has done it. I mean, he's notorious for never schmoozing with anybody. He'll go to, see, contributors like to think that you like them. It's a trick, of course, but they do want to believe you like them, and they think you're a friend of theirs. They always say, you know, Bill and Hillary are friends of ours. Oh, yeah, you're friends, but yeah, they're friends, but, you know, it's paid for. But, you know, but Obama doesn't put up with any of that. He just, you know, stay away. And so I think it's a problem for him, and I'm not saying this would change everything, but it's a left. He doesn't have he ought to have 20 Democrats every night on the news and in the newspapers sticking with him, helping him out when he's in trouble. And you don't hear those voices. That's the dog that doesn't bark today. The normal supportive comments from people across the country who are loyal to the, and I think that's what's missing. For him. It's paid. It's hurt him.
First of all, I just want to thank the three of you guys for being here. I was actually at the Schwarzenegger Institute's event with Senator McCain, and as students, we're really thankful to have the resources and speakers such as yourself that we can see. My question is, considering the administration that we're in now, and it seems like you know, sequestration is a more appealing option than coming together to have a deal, do you think it's going to take an entirely new administration to see real economic and political progress, or do you think?
Depends who it is. You know, I don't know whether Romney would have been a good president or not. I don't know. I don't know whether McCain. I've always sort of liked McCain, but I don't know. He's got a temper. Yeah, everybody's a temper. But I do think the sequestration is a hot issue. $100 billion again in January, hurting the military again. And I do wonder whether, but I'll tell you this, simple answer. The only thing people liked about the last campaign last year, the only thing they liked about all in years was when Governor Christie got along with Obama on hurricane relief. It's the only thing that made people happy. Everything else has really bugged them. Congress is at 9% now. You can't. I don't know what the bottom is. Maybe 0, but 9.
Actually, it's down to 8.
Is it?
Yeah.
I've never seen like it. And people,
purpose is more popular than Congress right now. So I mean, that just shows you where Congress is. But I mean, Chris,
Murphy's just making a comeback.
The question really is that a lot of times, Chris, people get punished when they cross party line and when they start working with the other party. What is your take on that?
Well, I think Christie may be the nominee. I think it's an uphill battle for him. I think that, yeah, it's a problem. You know it better. You're asking me the question. You know the answer. It is. You got to stand there. But you know who was the most greatest figure of the 20th century? It's Churchill, because Winston Churchill stood against the Tories who wanted to appease, and you know they were not the heroes of World War II. The heroes were the guys who fought them, and that was some of the labor guys, but mostly Churchill. He came out of nowhere and said, you know, you're all wrong. You know, Munich is wrong. You're going to pay for this. This is just the first sip. It's going to be worse every year. And he stood completely against the century, and he saved the honor of the century for doing it. You know, he did it. But he was never a follower. He was a leader.
have one, please.
Question, do you think that the divisive politics of today makes room for a third party in the middle, a place where folks like Charlie Crist could appeal to folks?
Charlie's a Democrat now. But Charlie's a great guy, but a guy who took a... I don't think Charlie's much of an ideologue or a philosopher. He's a practical guy. And Charlie went to independent. That didn't work. Now he's a Democrat now, and he's running against Rick Scott. That'll be an interesting race. But the trouble with the third party is it'll be like Israel or Germany, one of those countries. You'll end up having to have a coalition because you need a majority. So you need 270 electoral votes, I believe, and I think you need 218 in the House, and you need 60 in the Senate. So especially 60 in the Senate. How are you going to get 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything without a really locked-in coalition like you have in Britain now with the New Labour? So, I mean, it's an idea, but you know what will happen is historically, the Republicans came along in the 1850s and basically replaced the Whigs. So what you do have is you have a rising third party that replaces the second party, becomes the second party. Like Labour replaced the Liberals in Britain. So what you do, you really don't have a stable system of three parties. You end up having one fading out, I think. So I don't think it's the answer. You have to make up your mind. I hate, people say, I voted for Gene McCarthy in 1976, or I voted for John Anderson. I said, yeah, great. But the other guy won. And now we have this guy as president. So don't, you got to make your mind up.
Well, I just want to say that when you talk about coalitions, I think that sometimes can work very well. In Austria, for instance, is a perfect example where the Socialists and the Conservative Party are a coalition.
Wow.
And they both work together. There's never a strike. There is no problem. There they have the most spectacular kind of standard of living. They have the lowest unemployment rate in Europe. I mean, it's really extraordinary how well that country does by both parties working together, even though two different ideologies, but working together. And they've been re-elected again in the last election. So sometimes if it's a good coalition, it can work really well.
I see Speaker, Senator Hertzberg, Speaker of the California Assembly, a great distinction. Any thoughts on this? Any questions for our panel?
We call him Hertzy.
Experienced.
Hertzy.
I want to add one point is, one of the great things.
Speaker, could you stand, please?
I just want to say when Arnold came in, no one knows this because he didn't talk about it, and it was one of the great things. I'm a Democrat. He's another party. I never used the other term. And he came and met with every labor leader. The building trades said, I've never had a governor in my office, irrespective of a Democrat or Republican. He went to the teachers union. He went to SEIU, Service Employees Union. And he didn't talk substantively, he made it personal. And I think that framed the foundation for the first part of his administration, because I think if you look back at the Schwarzenegger administration, I spent a lot of time with him as a Democrat and stuck my neck out because I like him. I think he's a real guy. I don't think he plays politics. He didn't sit and read polls. He was a guy who says, Hertzy, sounds like a good idea, let's do it. He just made it happen. And for whatever reason, I think that courage, and it was just wonderful. It was just encouraging to see. And I just want to share, Mr. Matthews talked about this, and I think the biggest problem from somebody who's lived in the belly of the beast so long is that there are institutions, that there are the green team and the red team, or the Cardinals against the Trojans, and they can't like each other. And so it became very difficult from a staff perspective. Bonnie, who came into the administration, was a Democrat, was a senior advisor and regent and all the other things she did. And these teams didn't trust each other. Dunmoy over here, who was cabinet secretary and a bunch of other stuff, he was a big Cheezo Republican, and we did a lot of stuff together, but there were very, very few. And I just think one of the challenges you have is not the genius of the leader, but it is the framework. This idea you ask about the third party, and I'll end on this, is that we spent the last 40 years writing the laws to stop that from happening. The Bull Moose Party, the examples of people that were presidents who ran for third parties. It's very, very difficult when you do the diagnostic. We looked, if you remember, Arnold, at doing a California party. So
well,
it's a really interesting challenge. I just tell you that I'm part of this as a Democrat because it is about fixing stuff, and this cat was about fixing stuff. I didn't agree with him about everything, but you could argue with him and move on to the next stuff and have a stogie.
Professor Starr?
Exactly, yeah, well, I just wanted to add a nice stogie. I hope it is a good cohiba. But in California, they kept saying to us, it's impossible to create political reform. It will never happen. Redistricting will never happen. Open primaries will never happen. Both parties hate it. They will spend money against you, and they did. Remember, we had to raise $31 million on one of the campaigns to just make it win because labor raised money and the businesses raised money against us. So there were a lot of people against us. But I always say political courage is not political suicide. And never give up. If you have a clear vision about something, go for it, no matter how long it takes.
Well,
so anything is possible.
I want to thank you, Governor, for not just establishing the institution, but coming here. And I'm thinking also of your wonderful post-partisan speech, your first inaugural speech as governor, where you struck some of the themes that were characterized. And I also want to say what a pleasure. It's one thing to see someone on television, and Mr. Matthews and I were reporters together at the Examiner, and it's another thing to find a sort of carefulness and scholarship and good writing, and the narrative voice of this book is very appealing, and there's a sort of subtle and not too elaborate, but it's very subtle and very powerful stream of autobiography in here, because this is your life. This is what you were attracted to as a young man, to what you've given your time. And with that, we'll just maybe...
Yes.
Thank you.
I think we could truly go on all night. Obviously, the questions don't want to end, but we've had great thinkers and great scholars and great students in the room, and I'd like to have all of us continue the discussion, walking down the hall to our reception. In the meantime, I hope you buy a copy of the book, perhaps for yourself and your friends to give as holiday gifts on your way out. So thank you very much. Fantastic.